I'm Sarah, 29 years old, and for most of my life I believed my family's love came with conditions I could never quite meet. I thought the constant feeling of being second best was just my insecurity talking. I had no idea that everything I'd experienced growing up was about to be validated in the most devastating way possible, when my family's true priorities would be laid bare for everyone to see. What happened when my sister needed help versus when I needed help didn't just open my eyes. It shattered every illusion I'd ever held about what family was supposed to mean. If you've ever felt like the forgotten child, the one whose problems don't matter as much, the one whose pain gets minimized while others get endless support, this story is going to resonate with you deeply. And if you've ever wondered whether your family dynamics were actually as unhealthy as they felt, you might find the clarity you've been searching for. Let me take you back to where this all began, because the pattern was there long before I had words to describe it. Growing up, our house had an invisible hierarchy that everyone understood but nobody talked about. My sister Emma was 2 years younger than me, born when I was just old enough to remember the shift in attention. She was the baby, the one with the bright smile and easy laugh, the one who could charm her way out of any trouble. I was the serious one, the responsible one, the one who cleaned up messes without being asked and kept my struggles to myself. Emma got dance lessons that cost hundreds of dollars a month. When I asked for violin lessons, my parents said we needed to watch our spending. Emma got designer clothes for school while I wore hand-me-downs from cousins. When I pointed this out, I was told I was being materialistic and should focus on more important things. Emma's room was redecorated twice during high school because she got bored with the colors. My room kept the same pink wallpaper from when I was 7, even though I begged to change it when I turned 15. When I saved up my babysitting money to buy new bedding, my mother asked why I couldn't just appreciate what I had. The differences weren't just about money. When Emma struggled with math, she got a tutor immediately. When I struggled with social anxiety, I was told I needed to try harder to make friends. When Emma had friendship drama, the whole family rallied around her, discussing strategies and offering endless emotional support. When I dealt with bullying at school, I was asked what I had done to provoke it. I learned early that my problems were character flaws to overcome, while Emma's problems were challenges the family would help her through. In college, this pattern continued but became more sophisticated. Emma chose an expensive private school for art therapy, and my parents proudly talked about supporting her creative dreams. I chose a state school for psychology, and they complained about even that expense. Emma changed her major 3 times, extending her college experience and the costs. When I asked for help with a summer abroad program that would have enhanced my psychology degree, I was told we couldn't afford extras. Emma's grades were celebrated when they were good and excused when they were bad. The professors didn't understand her artistic temperament, the workload was unreasonable, the system wasn't designed for creative minds. My consistent high grades were expected and rarely acknowledged, but any grade below an A warranted a conversation about whether I was taking my education seriously enough. I started noticing how family stories were told and retold. Emma's funny college mishaps became beloved family legends. My academic achievements were mentioned briefly, and then the conversation moved on to more interesting topics, usually something Emma had done or said. During my junior year of college, something shifted in Emma that none of us fully understood at the time. She became erratic, missing classes, spending money recklessly, staying up for days and then crashing for entire weekends. She was experimenting with drugs, starting with marijuana and escalating to cocaine and eventually opioids. The signs were all there, but our family's response revealed everything about how we functioned. When Emma's grades started slipping dramatically, she was diagnosed with ADHD and depression. The family immediately mobilized, researching doctors, trying different medications, adjusting her course load, hiring academic coaches. When her behavior became more erratic, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Again, the family researched extensively, found the best psychiatrists, adjusted medications, made accommodations. I was simultaneously dealing with my own mental health struggles, anxiety, depression, and what I would later learn was complex trauma from years of emotional neglect. But when I mentioned these struggles, I was told everyone feels anxious sometimes, that I needed to practice more gratitude, that maybe I was just stressed about graduation. When Emma started missing family dinners and showing up to events clearly under the influence, the family's response was to make excuses, lower expectations, and protect her from consequences. When I mentioned that I was struggling with panic attacks during my senior year, I was told that I had always been dramatic and needed to learn better coping mechanisms. Emma's drug use escalated throughout my senior year. She was stealing money from our parents, lying about her whereabouts, and her behavior was becoming increasingly dangerous. But every family conversation centered around how to help her, what resources to access, how to support her recovery. Meanwhile, I was struggling to function. The anxiety had become debilitating, but I was still maintaining my grades, still showing up to family obligations, still keeping my problems mostly to myself. The few times I tried to express how overwhelmed I felt, the response was that I needed to be more supportive of Emma during her difficult time. After graduation, I moved back home temporarily while applying to graduate programs. Emma was supposed to graduate that spring, but her addiction had derailed her completely. She was using daily, had been kicked out of her apartment for not paying rent, and was stealing from local stores to support her habit. This was when the financial reality of our family's priorities became impossible to ignore. My parents spent $15,000 on Emma's rehabilitation. Not just the treatment itself, but the therapy, the family counseling sessions, the aftercare programs, the sober living facility, the medical bills, and multiple attempts at different treatment centers when the first ones didn't work. They researched the best facilities, drove hours to visit different programs, took time off work for family therapy sessions, and restructured their entire lives around Emma's recovery process. They attended support groups for families of addicts, read books about addiction, and became experts on treatment modalities. When Emma relapsed after her first treatment program, they immediately researched other options and enrolled her in a more intensive program. When she relapsed again, they found a long-term residential facility. Each program cost thousands of dollars, and they paid without question, refinancing their house to cover the expenses. During this same period, I was struggling with what I now know was severe depression and PTSD from years of emotional neglect and family dysfunction. I was having panic attacks several times a week, couldn't sleep, had developed an eating disorder, and was barely functioning despite appearing successful on the surface. I researched therapists and asked my parents if they could help with the cost. Therapy was $120 per session, and I was hoping to go weekly or twice a week initially to address the crisis I was experiencing. Their response was immediate and crushing. Therapy was too expensive. I was an adult now and needed to handle my own problems. If I really needed help, I could find sliding scale options or use online resources. They suggested I try meditation apps or self-help books instead. When I pointed out that they had just spent $15,000 on Emma's treatment, they explained that Emma had a real medical condition while I was just going through normal stress. Addiction was a disease that required medical intervention. My issues were emotional problems that I needed to work through on my own. When I pressed further, pointing out that mental health was also medical and that my symptoms were severely impacting my life, they became frustrated. I was being selfish to compare my situation to Emma's life-threatening addiction. I was being ungrateful for everything they had provided me. I was being manipulative by bringing up money during a family crisis. This was the moment when everything crystallized for me. The pattern I had felt my entire life wasn't in my head. It was the operating system of our family. Emma's problems were real, worthy of attention, deserving of financial sacrifice and emotional energy. My problems were character flaws, personal weaknesses, and attention-seeking behavior. I found a therapist who offered sliding scale fees and began the painful process of unpacking decades of emotional neglect while watching my family pour unlimited resources into my sister's recovery. Each family dinner became an update on Emma's progress, discussions of new treatment approaches, celebrations of small victories, and strategizing around setbacks. My own healing journey was invisible to them. When I mentioned insights from therapy or progress I was making, the conversation quickly shifted back to Emma's recovery or other topics. When I set small boundaries around family dynamics, I was accused of being difficult during an already stressful time. Emma's recovery became the central narrative of our family. Her struggle was heroic, her setbacks were understandable, her progress was inspiring. My recovery was self-indulgent, my boundaries were selfish, my growth was barely acknowledged. The financial disparity became even more stark over the following 2 years. Emma went through 4 different treatment programs, each costing thousands of dollars. She moved back home multiple times between relapses, and my parents covered all her expenses: food, clothing, transportation, medical bills, legal fees when she was arrested for possession. During this same period, I was paying for my own therapy while working 2 jobs and applying to graduate programs. I was making real progress in understanding and healing from my childhood trauma, but I was doing it alone and on my own dime. When I was accepted to a competitive PhD program in clinical psychology, my parents' response was lukewarm. They were proud, they said, but worried about more student debt. When Emma completed her first 30 days of sobriety, they threw a celebration dinner and invited extended family to acknowledge her achievement. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore, but what made it truly devastating was how my family responded when I started pointing it out. In therapy, I was learning about emotional neglect, family systems, and trauma responses. I was beginning to understand that my lifelong feelings of inadequacy weren't character flaws, but responses to consistent invalidation and deprioritization. I was developing language for experiences I had never been able to articulate. When I tried to share these insights with my family, hoping for understanding or even acknowledgement of the patterns, their response was swift and harsh. I was being dramatic. I was pathologizing normal family dynamics. I was trying to make Emma's addiction about me. I was being selfish and manipulative. Most devastatingly, they suggested that my interest in therapy was becoming unhealthy, that I was creating problems that didn't exist, that I was too focused on the past instead of moving forward. They worried that my therapist was filling my head with ideas that were damaging family relationships. This was when I realized that my family's investment in Emma's recovery was not actually about mental health or healing. It was about managing a problem that affected them directly. Emma's addiction created chaos in their lives, embarrassed them socially, and required their intervention. My emotional neglect trauma was invisible to them and didn't impact their daily experience, so it didn't warrant attention or resources. Emma's problems were external and dramatic: arrests, overdoses, hospital visits, missing money. My problems were internal and manageable. I still showed up, still performed, still maintained relationships despite my struggles. The realization was shattering, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I understood that the problem wasn't me. During my first year of graduate school, Emma had her longest period of sobriety, almost 8 months. The family was celebrating this milestone, and there was talk of her finally being ready to rebuild her life. She was living at home, working part-time, attending meetings, and seeming genuinely committed to recovery. This was when I made what I thought was a reasonable request for family support. I was struggling financially in graduate school, working as a teaching assistant while managing a full course load and beginning my research thesis. I had calculated that my therapy costs over the past 2 years totaled around $3,000, money I had scraped together through part-time jobs, student loans, and careful budgeting. I asked my parents if they would consider reimbursing me for some of these therapy expenses, pointing out that they had spent 5 times as much on Emma's treatment and that my mental health treatment was equally valid and necessary. Their response revealed the depths of their bias in a way that I could never have anticipated. I was told that Emma's situation was different because she was truly sick, while my therapy was a choice I was making to feel better about normal life challenges. Emma's treatment was medically necessary, while mine was optional self-improvement. Emma's addiction could have killed her, while my anxiety and depression were just difficult emotions that everyone experiences. When I pointed out that my symptoms had been severe enough to impact my functioning, and that depression and trauma also have serious health consequences, they dismissed this comparison entirely. Emma's problems were visible and urgent. Mine were internal and manageable. Most crushingly, they suggested that my focus on therapy was actually making me more fragile and less resilient. In their view, I had become too focused on analyzing every family interaction and assigning blame instead of just moving forward with my life. They worried that therapy was teaching me to be a victim instead of taking responsibility for my own happiness. This conversation happened during a family dinner, with Emma present and several relatives visiting for a holiday weekend. The audience made their dismissal even more humiliating, but it also meant that other people witnessed how casually they minimized my mental health needs while defending their extensive investment in Emma's recovery. What happened next changed everything, because Emma did something that forced everyone to confront the reality of our family dynamics. Emma had been listening to this entire conversation, watching our parents dismiss my mental health needs after years of their unlimited support for her recovery. After dinner, she pulled me aside privately and said something that validated everything I had been feeling. She told me that she had always known I was treated differently, that our parents had different standards and expectations for us, and that she felt guilty about the disparity in support we received. She had been aware during her addiction that her problems consumed all the family's emotional and financial resources, while my needs were overlooked. More importantly, she shared that in her recovery meetings, she had learned about family systems and how addiction affects entire families. She recognized that I had been in a caretaker role our entire lives, that my needs had been consistently minimized, and that this pattern was emotionally abusive. Emma's validation meant everything to me, but what happened after our conversation revealed the true nature of our family system. Emma decided to advocate for me during the next family gathering, pointing out the disparity in treatment we had received and suggesting that our parents owe me both an acknowledgement and some financial support for my therapy costs. Our parents' response was swift and devastating. They accused Emma of being manipulated by me, suggested that her judgment was compromised by her mental health issues, and worried that she was being drawn into unhealthy dynamics that could threaten her recovery. They told Emma that part of her recovery process needed to involve setting boundaries with family members who were creating drama, and they suggested that my influence was potentially harmful to her sobriety. This was the moment when I realized that our family system couldn't tolerate examination or change, even when it came from the very person they had spent years and thousands of dollars trying to help. Emma's support for me was reframed as a threat to her recovery. My desire for acknowledgement was characterized as manipulation that could endanger her sobriety. The family narrative required me to remain the problem child whose needs were secondary to Emma's wellness. When Emma continued to advocate for me and point out the unfairness of our treatment, our parents made a decision that revealed their true priorities. They told Emma that she needed to choose between supporting her recovery by maintaining family harmony or jeopardizing her progress by engaging in destructive family conflicts. Emma was forced to choose between advocating for me and maintaining her relationship with our parents. Under pressure and fearful of losing the support system that had sustained her recovery, she withdrew her advocacy and returned to the family narrative that my focus on therapy was divisive and potentially harmful. Watching Emma be pressured to abandon her support for me was the final piece of evidence I needed to understand that our family system was fundamentally dysfunctional and would not change, regardless of how much insight, growth, or healing any of us achieved individually. This realization was devastating but also liberating because it freed me to make decisions based on my own well-being rather than hoping for family acknowledgement or support. I continued my graduate studies while maintaining minimal contact with my family. I focused on my research, my clinical training, and my own continued therapy. I stopped attending family gatherings where Emma's recovery was celebrated while my progress was ignored. I stopped sharing my achievements or struggles with parents who had proven they were not capable of providing appropriate support. During my third year of graduate school, something happened that provided external validation for everything I had experienced and understood about our family dynamics. I was selected for a highly competitive research fellowship that included a full scholarship, a living stipend, and funding for my dissertation research. This fellowship was awarded to only 5 students nationwide in my field, and it came with significant prestige and recognition. The selection committee specifically noted my research proposal on family systems and emotional neglect, praising my insights into how childhood emotional neglect impacts adult mental health and relationships. My personal experience with these dynamics, combined with my academic training, had positioned me as an expert in this area. When I shared this news with my family, their response was predictably lukewarm. They were proud, they said, but worried about how much time I was spending focused on negative family dynamics. They hoped this research wouldn't prevent me from moving past old grievances and building healthier relationships. What they didn't know was that my fellowship included opportunities for public speaking, media appearances, and publication in major mental health publications. My research was gaining national attention, and I was being recognized as a leading voice on emotional neglect and family trauma. 6 months after receiving the fellowship, I was invited to speak at a major mental health conference about emotional neglect in families. My presentation included case studies and research findings, but it also included my personal story as an example of how emotional neglect operates in seemingly functional families. I discussed the pattern of differential treatment, the minimization of one child's needs while amplifying another's, the financial and emotional resources allocated based on whose problems were deemed most worthy of attention. I presented data showing that emotional neglect creates lasting trauma that requires professional treatment, that children who experience consistent invalidation develop complex mental health issues that are often invisible to families but profoundly impact their functioning and relationships. The presentation was recorded and made available online, where it received hundreds of thousands of views and was shared widely among mental health professionals and individuals who recognized their own experiences in my story. Several major news outlets picked up the story, interviewing me about emotional neglect and its impact on families. I was featured in magazine articles, podcast interviews, and television segments discussing how families can unintentionally create trauma through patterns of favoritism and invalidation. My research was being cited by other academics, my therapeutic insights were being incorporated into treatment protocols, and I was being consulted by other mental health professionals working with clients from emotionally neglectful families. The external validation was overwhelming and healing, but the real vindication came when my family finally understood the extent of my success and recognition. During one of my television interviews, I was introduced as Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a leading expert on family emotional neglect, whose groundbreaking research was transforming how mental health professionals understand childhood trauma. The interviewer specifically mentioned my personal experience with emotional neglect and how it had informed my professional work, noting that I had overcome significant family dysfunction to become a nationally recognized expert in trauma and family systems. Several of my parents' friends and colleagues saw these interviews and media appearances, reaching out to congratulate them on having such a successful daughter whose work was making such an important impact. This was when my family finally began to grasp that my therapy, my focus on family dynamics, and my academic work weren't self-indulgent victim mentality. They were the foundation of significant professional achievement and national recognition. Their response to my success revealed both how little they had understood my journey and how much their perspective could shift when my accomplishments became publicly visible and socially impressive. Suddenly, they wanted to be involved in my work, to attend my speaking engagements, to share my achievements with their social circles. They began describing my research as groundbreaking and my success as a source of family pride. But their desire to claim my success came with an expectation that I would downplay the personal experiences that had informed my work. They hoped I could focus on the academic achievements while minimizing the family dynamics that had shaped my research. When I continued to speak openly about emotional neglect and its impact on families, including specific examples from my own childhood, they became uncomfortable with the public attention my work was receiving. This was when I realized that my family could celebrate my success as long as it didn't require them to examine their own behavior or acknowledge their role in my trauma. Their pride in my achievements was conditional on my willingness to protect their reputation and maintain their preferred family narrative. The final confrontation came during a family gathering where extended relatives were present, many of whom had seen my media appearances and were asking questions about my work. When a cousin asked about the personal experiences that had informed my research, my parents quickly changed the subject, suggesting that my work focused on other families' problems rather than our own family dynamics. This was my moment of choice. I could continue to protect their reputation and minimize my own experiences, or I could speak truthfully about the patterns I had researched and lived. I chose truth. I explained to the gathered relatives that my research had indeed been informed by my personal experience with emotional neglect, specifically the pattern of differential treatment between Emma and me throughout our childhood and into our adult mental health struggles. I described the financial and emotional investment in Emma's addiction recovery compared to the dismissal of my mental health needs, the minimization of my achievements compared to the celebration of Emma's progress, and the family system that required me to remain the problem child, while Emma received unlimited support and understanding. I spoke about how these patterns had created lasting trauma that required professional treatment, how my therapy had been both healing and academically valuable, and how my research was helping other families recognize and address similar dynamics. The silence that followed was profound, because everyone present could recognize the truth of what I was describing. Many of them had witnessed these patterns over the years, but had never had language to describe them or permission to acknowledge them. My parents' response was immediate and predictable. I was being dramatic, creating problems that didn't exist, and embarrassing the family by sharing private matters publicly. They suggested that my success had made me arrogant, and that I was using my professional credentials to pathologize normal family dynamics. But something had shifted in the room, because other relatives began sharing their own observations of the differential treatment Emma and I had received over the years. They had noticed the patterns but had assumed it was just parental preference rather than recognizing it as a form of emotional neglect. The validation from extended family members was profound, but what mattered most was that I had finally spoken my truth without minimizing my experience or protecting my parents' reputation. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. I established clear boundaries about how I would and wouldn't participate in family relationships going forward. I would no longer attend gatherings where my achievements were minimized or my experiences were dismissed. I would no longer provide emotional support to family members who were unwilling to acknowledge their impact on my mental health. I would no longer pretend that our family dynamics were healthy or normal to protect anyone's comfort. I offered to participate in family therapy to work on these relationships, but only with a therapist experienced in emotional neglect and family trauma who could help address these patterns directly. I made it clear that my success and recognition had not made me bitter or vengeful, but they had given me the confidence and resources to require healthy relationship dynamics rather than accepting whatever treatment was offered. Most importantly, I explained that my work helping other families heal from emotional neglect was now my primary focus, and I would continue to speak publicly about these dynamics, regardless of their comfort level. The aftermath of this confrontation has been both challenging and liberating. Some family members have been willing to engage in the difficult work of examining family patterns and working toward healthier relationships. They've attended therapy sessions, read my research, and made genuine efforts to understand how their behavior affected me throughout my life. Others have maintained their position that I'm being dramatic and divisive, and they've chosen to limit their relationship with me rather than examine their own behavior. Emma's response has been the most complex and evolving. Her recovery program had taught her about family systems and trauma, so she understood the validity of my experiences. But she also felt guilty about the role her addiction had played in the family's differential treatment of us. Through our individual and joint therapy sessions, we've been able to work through these dynamics and build a healthier relationship based on mutual understanding and support, rather than competition for family resources. Emma has also become an advocate for addressing emotional neglect in families, recognizing that her addiction both contributed to and was exacerbated by our dysfunctional family system. My parents' journey has been slower and more resistant. They've attended some therapy sessions, but they struggle to move beyond defensiveness and hurt feelings to genuine understanding of their impact. They want a relationship with me, especially now that my professional success brings social recognition to the family, but they haven't fully accepted responsibility for the patterns of emotional neglect that shaped my childhood and continued into my adulthood. Progress has been incremental, but there have been meaningful moments of acknowledgement and change. They've begun to recognize some of the differential treatment Emma and I received, and they've expressed regret for dismissing my mental health needs while investing extensively in Emma's recovery. Most significantly, they've offered to reimburse me for my therapy costs, not because they fully understand the impact of their behavior, but because they recognize that therapy was as medically necessary for me as addiction treatment was for Emma. While this financial gesture doesn't undo years of emotional neglect, it represents some acknowledgement that my mental health needs were valid and deserving of investment. The ongoing family work is difficult and sometimes disappointing, but it's grounded in honesty and authentic relationship rather than the performance and pretense that characterized our previous dynamics. What has been most healing is the response from people who have heard my story through my research and media appearances. Thousands of individuals have reached out to share their own experiences with emotional neglect, expressing gratitude for language to describe their childhood experiences and validation that their struggles were real and worthy of attention. Many have sought therapy for the first time after recognizing their own patterns in my research, and they've reported significant healing and improved relationships as a result. Mental health professionals have incorporated my research into their practice, reporting better outcomes for clients from emotionally neglectful families who finally have framework for understanding their experiences. The community of people healing from emotional neglect has become a source of profound connection and purpose for me, reminding me that our personal healing can create ripple effects that help countless others. My work has expanded beyond research into direct clinical practice, where I specialize in treating adults from emotionally neglectful families. I've written extensively about these dynamics, developed therapeutic protocols for addressing emotional neglect, and trained other professionals in recognizing and treating these patterns. The little girl who was told her problems didn't matter, whose mental health needs were dismissed as character flaws, whose achievements were minimized while her sister's struggles consumed the family's resources, has become a nationally recognized expert whose work is helping families heal from these very patterns. This transformation didn't happen despite my family's emotional neglect. It happened because of my commitment to understanding, healing from, and ultimately helping others navigate these complex dynamics. Every day, I receive messages from people who see themselves in my story, who finally have language for their childhood experiences, who are beginning to understand that their struggles were real and their feelings were valid. This is the true vindication, not that my family finally recognized my worth, though some of that healing has occurred, but that my experience has been transformed into a source of healing and hope for countless others who felt invisible, dismissed, and unworthy of attention in their own families. If you've made it this far in my story, you've probably recognized some of your own experiences in what I've shared. Maybe you were the child whose problems were minimized while a sibling received unlimited support. Maybe you've struggled to understand why your family's love felt conditional, or why your achievements never seemed to matter as much as someone else's struggles. Maybe you've questioned whether your mental health needs were valid, or whether you were being too sensitive about family dynamics that everyone else seemed to accept as normal. I want you to know that your feelings are valid, your experiences matter, and your mental health deserves the same investment and attention that would be given to any other medical condition. Emotional neglect is real, it creates lasting impact, and it requires professional treatment to heal. You are not being dramatic, manipulative, or attention-seeking by recognizing these patterns or seeking help to address them. Your worth is not determined by your family's ability to see and appreciate you. Your value exists independently of their recognition, and you deserve relationships that celebrate your achievements, support your struggles, and invest in your well-being. Healing from emotional neglect is possible, but it requires breaking free from family narratives that minimize your experiences and establishing relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. If you're ready to begin this healing journey, I encourage you to seek professional support, educate yourself about emotional neglect and family systems, and connect with others who understand these experiences. Remember that choosing healing doesn't make you ungrateful or disloyal to your family. It makes you brave enough to break generational patterns and create the kind of relationships you deserved all along. The path from invisible child to empowered adult is challenging but possible, and every step you take toward healing creates space for others to do the same. Your story matters, your healing matters, and you deserve all the support and recognition that may have been missing in your childhood. Have you experienced similar patterns of favoritism or emotional neglect in your family? How did you recognize these dynamics, and what steps have you taken toward healing? Share your story in the comments. This community understands and supports each other through these difficult but transformative journeys. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more content about healing from family trauma and building healthy relationships. Together we can break these patterns and create the kind of families and communities where everyone's worth is recognized and celebrated.